The Echo of My Shout by VMS Part 2. Now we are in the 8th chapter. Two histories, one horizon. It occurred to Mira not as a guilt but as awakening. For months she had been unfolding her history like a long guarded manuscript. Each page heavy with the sacrifice, surrender, and solitude. Rajiv had received it with unwavering steadiness. He had listened without any kind of interruption, without fatigue, without centering himself, and suddenly one quiet afternoon, as she sat across from him and felt the imbalance. I've spoken so much, she said slowly, about my pain, my battles, my echoes. I have rested in your listening as though it were my right, but I have not asked, what about you? Raju smiled faintly, almost evasively. This is not about me. That she replied gently, precisely why it must be. He looked at her then, not as a composed cardiologist accustomed to crisis management, but as a man momentarily unshielded. You see me as stable, he said after a pause, anchored, but anchors rust too. She waited, and I know, yes, I do understand, Rajiv. There was a long silence before he began, not because he did not know what to say, but because he has trained himself not to say it to anybody. My marriage, he said evenly, was not violent, it was vacant, a kind of void. He described the early years' ambition, prestige, social ascent. His wife, elegant and socially agile, thrived in elite clubs and curated gatherings. Appearances were immaculate, photographs impeccable, and but intimacy was ration. After 12-hour surgeries, he said his voice was steady but it threaded with the fatigue, and remembered, I would return home physically depleted. Sometimes I did not expect affection, but I would have been content with the small gestures, a glass of water, a question about my day. He gave a small but almost embarrassed laugh, and it never came. Instead, evenings were dominated by guestless networking dinners, curated performances of prosperity. Emotional conversation was deemed unnecessarily vulnerability and inconvenience. She did not see my exhaustion, he continued, or perhaps she did and considered it irrelevant. And Mira's heart constricted, not with comparison but with recognition. The children, she asked softly, they were loud, and he said quickly and but inconsistently. Their emotional needs were often unsourced, and nannies and tutors and structured activities. My mother intervened more than she should have needed to. He spoke of his mother, fierce, protective, disapproving what she perceived as moral delusion. She stepped in not out of intrusion but out of alarm. She shielded the children from where she believed was a toxic indifference. I was torn, Rajiv admitted, between preserving the marriage and protecting my children. Over time, distance hardened into fracture, arguments escalated, not over infidelity or scandal, but over values, and money became leverage, and social status became weapon. His wife demanded autonomy without accountability, luxury without reciprocity. And when divorce came, he said quietly, it felt less like a catastrophe and more like admission. The settlement was immense, and he did not contest it. I gave her what she wanted, he said, alimony large enough to silence further litigation, properties, investments. I do not want my children to grow up watching us devour and each other. And you, Mira asked, and he smiled faintly. I retained my profession. The children, now grown up and established, had forged their own trajectories. They loved him, respected him, but the years of quiet endurance had etched something to him, a subdued rebellion. I began to question everything he confessed. Why had I tolerated emotional drought, and why had I equated responsibility with self erasure? I held hearts in operating theaters, yet ignored my own, and there had been periods of reckless distraction, long work hours, emotionally detached companionship, a refusal to anchor anyway too deeply, not scandalous but restless. And I told myself I did not need partnership. He said that solitude was a vision. Mira regarded him as a tenderness, free of pity. And then she asked, and then I met a woman who spoke of echoes. He replied softly. She did not smile immediately. She absorbed the weight of his admission. You listen to me, she said, while carrying all of this. I did not carry it as grievance. And he answered, I carry it as history, but history does not have to be repeated habitation. And he reached for her hand. His touch warm, deliberate. My priorities are clear right now, Mira. He continued. My children are settled. My professional legacy is stable. I do not seek wealth nor validation nor spectacle. I seek companionship that is conscious. And with you, I feel that possibility. And she studied him carefully. You call me your karmic partner, she said, but karma is not merely romance, it is a responsibility. I know, he replied, which is why I do not want us to bound only by our wounds. I do not want your past to dominate your present, nor mine. And his gaze deepened, not intense but resolute. I want to walk with you, he said, not ahead, not behind, not behind, lifelong, not as a rescuer and rescue, not as a martyr and savior, as equals who have survived. The simplicity of his declaration unsettled her in the most restorative way. For so long, she murmured, my relationship were arenas of proving, defending, negotiating with you. I do not feel that need to earn space, and I, he said quietly, do not feel unseen. The air between them altered, not heavy with confession now, but vibrant with possibility. Let us be deliberate, he added. We will remember our past only as teachers, not as scripts to reenact, and we will cultivate a present that is romantic, not because it denies pain, but because it transcends it. She laughed softly. You speak like a man designing a treatment plan. Old habits, he admitted. They sat in compassionable silence, the kind born of avoidance but of integration. Outside evening, descending into gradual hues, and inside something brighter emerged, not naive optimism, but chosen vitality. Mira realized that the healing was no longer a solitary evacuation, it was a shared architecture. And Rajiv, once a straightforward listener, has revealed his own fractures, and in doing so, he had dismantled the hierarchy of suffering between them. And they were no longer two monologues of pain, and there was one horizon. I do not want us to forget everything, Meera said thoughtfully, but I do want us to forgive ourselves for surviving imperfectly. He nodded, then let our future be vibrant, he said, not haunted, not and our present, she asked, a hint of playful warmth returning to her voice. He smiled, this time not as a cardiologist, not as a divorcee, not as a survivor, as romantic as we dare. In that moment, neither of them were defined by courtroom defeats or a marital voids, by police stations, or or by elite clubs, by alimony or accusations. They were simply two adults who had transferred deserts and found unexpectedly a garden, and this time they chose not to wander alone. The next is the comic confluence. There are meetings that feel accidental, and there are some convergences that feel authored by something older than memory. Meera began to sense that she and Rajiv shared was not merely companionship born of compatible wounds, but a crossing of destinies, two currents that had traveled through separate terrains of drought and turbulence only to merge with a deliberate inevitability. Karma, she knew as a psychologist, could be interrupted metaphorically, and a pattern of choices, an inheritance of conditioning. But with Rajiv, the word carried a subtler resonance, and it was not mystical superstition, it was a recognition, a familiarity unburdened by explanation. Their relationship evolved beyond confession, it became construction. They decided quietly at first to collaborate, not merely emotionally but professionally. Rajiv's expertise in cardiology and psychosomatic medicine intervened with Meera's trauma-informed psychological practice. They began conceptualizing an integrated wellness initiative, one that acknowledged the indivisibility of body and memory. The heart remembers what the mind tries to forget. I repeat, the heart remembers what the mind tried to forget, Rajiv would say in seminars, and the mind often suffers when the body endures, Meera would add. The heart remembers what the mind tried tries to forget, Rajiv would say in seminars, and the mind often suffers when the body endures, Mira would add. They joined lectures drew attention not because of spectacle but because of coherence, and they did not perform partnership, they embodied it. Audiences sensed an authenticity that could be rehearsed. And whispers calculated, some admired, some speculated, some doubted. She is controversial. One senior physician remarked, recalling her legal battles. He divorced, another murmured, referring Raj's past, but they no longer flinched at rumor. For years, both had lived under scrutiny, says she in courtrooms, he in elite social circles, and now scrutiny felt almost ornamental. What they possessed was internally ratified. And when they appeared together at conference, heads did turn, and not because they sought attention, but because composure radiates. And Mira no longer carried the guarded intensity of someone bracing for attack. There was suppleness in a posture, quiet assurance. Rajiv once restrained to the point of emotional invisibility, allowed warmth to surface openly, and they were not ostentatious, and they were synchronized. And in private, their evolution was subtler but more profound. They travel occasionally not to escape but to expand. Early morning walks by unfamiliar coastlines and conversation in small cafes where anonymity offered relief. They spoke not of litigation or divorce but of literature, music, aging, mortality, and desire. Desire too matured between them, not frantic, not compensatory, but reverent. It carried the tenderness of two people who understood how easily bodies can become battlefields. With each other, touch was not conquest, it was reassurance. You feel different now, Rajiv observed. One evening, as they sat overlooking a rain drenched valley, how she asked, "You inhabit your own life," he replied. "Earlier, you were surviving it." She considered this carefully. "And you," she countered, "and I'm no longer negotiating affection," he said. "I receive it." Their karmic conference was not free of complexity, and there were moments when old reflexes resurfaced, her instinct of over to explain, his impulse to withdraw into stoic efficiency. And but unlike previous chapters of their lives, these reflexes were addressed rather than endured. When she sensed herself shrinking into apology, he would gently say, "You are not as inconvenienced." And when he retreated into silence after a grueling surgery, and she would sit beside him without interrogation, her presence as an unspoken assurance, and they became each other's recalibration. And society predictably attempted categorization, and where they colleagues, companions, late life romantics defying convention, opportunists leveraging visibility. They offered no public definitions. Instead, they cultivated substance, a wellness center they eventually co-founded became a testament to their shared vision. It did not advertise miracles, it offered integration, cardiac care informed by psychological insight, and trauma therapy informed by somatic awareness. And parents responded. A businessman with chronic hypertension found relief not only in medication but in confronting grief he has buried for decades. A woman with panic induced arrhythmia discovered that heart palpitations echoed unresolved childhood fear. Meera and Rajiv, working in quiet tandem, demonstrated that healing need not to be fragmented. Professionally, they turned heads, but more importantly, they turned inward patterns outward and transforming private suffering into public service. And one evening, after a particularly successful symposium where their collaborative model received standing ovation, Meera found herself watching Rajiv across the room as he spoke with young doctors, and there was vitality in him, not the performance charm of an elite circle, but a genuine engagement. He caught her gaze and smiled, a smile unburdened by performance. Later, as they drew home beneath a sky scattered with patient stars, and she said softly, "Do you ever think we met late?" He reflected before answering. "We met when we were ready," he said, "ready not to be rescued, but to be responsible for joy." The conversation about the future grew less tentative. They spoke of aging not as decline, but as a refinement of creating scholarships for students students who lacked institutional backing of writing together perhaps a book bridging medicine and memory. And as she asked, once a trace of vulnerability is still lingering, we continue, he replied simply with clarity. There was romance still, unexpected flowers left on her desk, handwritten notes slipped between medicinal journals, evenings where conversations yielded to quiet proximity, but theirs was not the favored romance of youth. It was a deliberate flame, tender rather than igniter. The karmic aspect of their union revealed itself not in dramatic coincidence but in equilibrium. They did not complete each other, they complemented trajectories already forged through fire. And Mira realized that echo, which once defined her internal landscape, had transformed into resonance shared with Rajiv. Her voice did not vibrate against emptiness and it was answered. And Rajiv, who had once returned from surgeries to a house aesthetically perfect yet emotionally barren, and now returned to presence, to dialogue, to warmth, to a woman who saw not only his competence but his fatigue, and they did not erase their past. They integrated them in public spaces, heads turned because people sense coherence in private spaces, silence felt fertile rather than for bonding. Comic confluence, Mira concluded, was not destiny imposed, it was a destiny chosen. Two individuals, once defined by endurance, not defined by expansion. Two histories, once heavy with litigation and loneliness, not walking side by side toward a horizon neither feared. And as they moved forward professionally, visible, emotionally aligned, romantically vibrant, they did not seek to prove anything to the world. They had already proven something far greater to themselves, that love, when conscious, can transform echoes into symphony. And the next chapter, it is about the fire, the fragrance, and the sacred ordinary. If airports and auditoriums were the public architecture of their partnership, the kitchen was its sanctuary. It was there amidst the gentle percussion of chopping boards and the aromatic scent of cumin and curry leaves, and the Mira that Mira and Rajiv felt most profoundly synchronized. One evenings when surgery schedules were lighter and foundation meetings concluded before dusk, and they retreated not to grand restaurants and not formal engagements, but to their kitchen overlooking the sea. Rajiv would roll up his sleeves with surprising enthusiasm for a man accustomed to sterile operating theaters. I manage hearts all day, he would say lightly. Let me now manage onions. And Mira laughed, handing him a knife with mock solemnity. Precision, doctor. They cook not with haste but with attention. She prepared his preferred dishes, simple, nourishing meals that balanced his demanding profession. Lightly spiced lentils, rich in protein, and sauteed grains with garlic, brown rice tempered with ghee, in measured modesty, grilled fish brushed with turmeric and lime. On weekends, she indulged him with slow cooked mutton curry, its aroma saturating the air like memory itself, though she is a pure vegetarian. Rajiv, in turn, experimented Italian risotto, stirred patiently, Mediterranean salads bright with olives and feta, and occasionally even baking rustic bread with determined imprecision for his dear Mira. Their movements were fluid, often wordless. She anticipated his reach for salt before he requested it, and he adjusted the flame beneath her simmering pan without disrupting her rhythm. Have we done this before? Rajiv once murmured, watching her tie her hair back with instinctive familiarity. She passed, smiling faintly. In another lifetime, perhaps. There was no dramatic mysticism in the statement, only intuitive recognition, and they often recalled, half in jest, half in reverence, that possibility that their souls had practiced this gymnastic choreography before. Then let us request, Rajiv said one evening, placing a small lamp before their household shrine, that if lifetimes exist, we are not delayed so long again. They prayed not for wealth nor acclaim, for continuity, for unbroken companionship. Mira Mira's care for Rajiv was not performative devotion, it was intelligent tenderness, and she recognized a surgical calendar with clinical efficiency, ensuring complex procedures were not clustered without adequate recovery intervals. She monitored his nutrition discreetly, adjusting his menus with his lipid profile fluctuated or when he appeared fatigued. And mornings of particularly intricate surgery, she woke early preparing warm herbal infusions, placing a handwritten note inside his briefcase, never sentimental excess, only quiet reassurance and a steady hands, clear mind, come home safely. Raju would read it in the hospital corridor, a subtle smile altering his otherwise composed expression. In return, he guarded her emotional bandwidth with equal deliberation. He observed when foundation responsibilities he encouraged excessively upon her mental reserves. Without announcement, he arranged periodic counseling sessions for her, not because she was unstable, but because even healers required supervised introspection. You deserve containment too, and he told her gently when she protested. Strength does not negate maintenance. He hired an efficient, discreet secretary to manage her expanding correspondence, publication requests, and conference logistics. The decision was practical yet symbolic. I want you, he said simply, to write, to think, to breathe, not drown in administration. Compatibility between them was not accidental chemistry, it was cultivated attentiveness. They discussed finances temperantly and delegate your responsibilities rationally, debate ideas intellectually, and when disagreements surfaced, as they inevitably did, they resolved them before sleep, unwilling to permit ego to colonize intimacy. But beyond companionship and care, there was passion, not frantic, not youthful in recklessness, but deep, assured, unhurried. At the dim light of their bedroom, with the sea breeze filtering through half drawn curtains, their intimacy was less about urgency and more about recognition. They approached each other without self consciousness, no longer burdened by comparison or performance. Every touch carried awareness of time once lost, every embrace was deliberate and grateful. Mira felt in Rajiv's presence not conquest but communion. His hands moved with reverence as though memorizing rather than claiming. Their kisses were layered with history, only not shared in months but decades for longing. Lived separately, desired after 50, she rediscovered was neither dismanaged nor desperate, it was refined. And there were evenings when laughter preceded closeness, an accidental spill of flour during cooking, and a playful argument over seasoning. And there were nights when silence itself ignited connection, when a single glance sufficed to communicate invitation. They did not rush and they explored each other with patient intensity, rediscovering vitality, not as proof of youth but as affirmation of aliveness. And afterwards, they had entwined, not speaking immediately, and breath gradually synchronized, heartbeat steady. It feels, Mira whispered once again, his shoulder as though the body. Forgiveness, the ears, and Rajiv traced that gentle patterns along her arm. It is not forgiveness, he murmured, it is arrival. And they were acutely aware that the destiny had deferred their union until later chapters of life. Perhaps that delay had cultivated appreciation. They did not postpone joy for future milestone. They did not assume infinite tomorrows. Weekend mornings were luxuriated in slow coffee on the balcony, shared reading, spontaneous road trips along the coast. They celebrated small achievements with disproportionate delight, and resident successful remarriage, a research paper accepted, a garden bloom. After 50, Mira reflected once, watching sunset strain the horizon amber. People expect decline. Rajiv smiled. They underestimate recalibration. Their love was not adolescent fantasy, it was deliberate stewardship. They had known loneliness intimately. They had survived betrayal. They had navigated public scrutiny. Now, in the sanctity of shared meals and shared beds, they constructed bliss not as extravagance but as discipline. Every day they chose. to nourish, to protect, to decide, to rest, to build. As the aroma of simmering spices mingled with salt-laden air, a surgical schedule aligned with counseling appointments is love to dissolve into whispered affection as they understood something quite profoundly. Second chances are not accidents, and they are honored through attention. And in that attentive, soul-saturated domesticity, Mira Rajiv found merely happiness but blessing. And when the past knocked again, the next chapter, peace Mira had learned in really unchallenged the months following the decision to live not cautiously but consciously for each other had been remain as their partnership, personal and professional, through it. Admiration, curiosity, and inevitability, resentment. It began with anonymous calls to Rajiv. Silence, on the other hand, then a faint laugh, then disconnection. Soon after, messages followed, cryptic at present, then insinuating grainy images clipped from old legal proceedings, selectively edited videos of courtroom exchanges, headlines resurrected from years past, habitual complainant, controversial psychologist, rebellious by nature. The past, it seemed, had discovered technology. One evening, Rajiv's phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I linked a short video compilation, Meera standing in a courtroom, voice firm but face strained, overlaid with sensational captions. He did not show it to her immediately. Instead, he watched it alone, jaw tightening, not in panic but in calculation. Whoever had assembled it understood optics, and they did not fabricate. They curated, context removed, and tone to start the narrative resurrected with malicious precision. The next day at a medical seminar, they were scheduled to address jointly. The air felt altered. A few glances lingered longer than usual. Conversation passed mid-sentences as they entered the hall. During the Q&A session, a journalist rose, a notepad poised, expression theoretically neutral. Dr. Io, Mira Io, he began, though his gaze flickered toward Rajiv, given your history of multiple legal confrontations and what some describe as a rebellious professional stance, and how do you expect the public to trust your current institutional leadership? And Dr. Rajiv, how can one enter a new life, particularly after 50, without fear or repetition? The hall still, the question was not inquiry, it was insinuation. Mira felt that the old tremor at the base of her spine, the echo threatening resurgence, a flash of courtrooms, advocates smirking of credibility dissected, but she could respond. Rajiv leaned forward slightly, his tone measured. Trust, he said calmly, is not built on the absence of history, it is built on the integrity with which one navigates it. A past Dr. Ray's legal battles or public record, he continued, they demonstrate not rebellion but refusal to accept misconduct in medicine and psychology alike. Ethical confrontation is not instability, it is responsibility. A journalist attempted interruption. Rajiv did not raise his voice. As for beginning anew after 50, added a faint, almost amused smile touching his lips. Maturity is not a liability, it is an asset, and to enter the chapter naively, we enter it consciously. A ripple moved through the audience, approval from the irritation and from some others, and Meera remained silent, not because she lacked articulation, but because Rajiv had already established the frame. And that session she turned to him quietly. You did not have to shield me. I did not shield you, he said gently, and I contextualized you. The harassment did not cease. Anonymous emails and suggested moral impropriety. Old acquaintances resurfaced online with a veiled commentary, and a tabloid blog speculated about their convenient partnership, and there were even insinuations that the wellness center was a facade of reputation laundering. It was strategic, disrupt peace, and so doubt force reaction. Rajiv responded with the diplomacy, not defensiveness. Legal notices were drafted where necessary. Digital security enhanced, and public statements remained succinct and factual. And he never allowed Mira to attend press meets alone, and not because you are incapable, he clarified once, sensing her insensitive resistance. And but when the partnership let them address us as such in interviews, when questions veered toward the scandal rather than the substance, he redirected it with a surgical precision. We are here to discuss integrated cardiac psychological care, and he would would say smoothly, in if there are any specific legal questions, they are documented and resolved. His tone was neither hostile nor apologetic, and it was definitive. And privately, when Mira's composure wavered, he did not dismiss her fear. It feels like they want to drag me back, she admitted one night, staring at her phone screen illuminated by yet another anonymous message as so I am not permitted peace. And they are testing endurance, and he replied, they mistake visibility for vulnerability. And what it if it escalates, she added, and then we respond proportionately, he said, not emotionally. And there were moments when anger flared with him, and particularly when insinuation targeted her character rather than her work. But he never allowed outrage to become spectacle. Rage is what they want, he said once, and it would validate the narrative. Instead, he chose composure as counterattack. At another conference, a panelist remarked casually, some would say your relationship is unconventional. Rajiv smiled lightly. Innovation often is. Laughter diffused tension. Mira observed him closely during these exchanges. He was not defensive, he was unshaken. His steadiness functioned not as a control but as a ballast, and yet she was no longer the woman who collapsed under scrutiny. And when a particularly intrusive reporter asked Dr. Ayo, do you deny being confrontational in your past institutions? And she responded herself this time, I did not deny advocating for accountability, she said evenly. And if that is perceived as confrontation, the terminology reflects more on the observation than on the act. The room quieted. She did not elaborate, she did not justify. They left together, hands brushing, not demonstratively but deliberately. Evil eyes did follow them. Rival professionals attempted subtle exclusion. A former associate circulated unverified rumors. Invitation to certain elite forums quietly evaporated, but something fundamental had shifted. Neither of them sought validation, not those quotas anymore. At home, there was no tantrums, no accusations, no exhaustion redirected at each other. They did not weaponize stress. When one grew silent, the other did not interrupt with withdrawal. And when one snapped briefly under fatigue, apology followed without pride obstructing it. They had endured too much externally to fracture internally. You know, Mira said once after a particularly exhausting week of public insinuation, earlier in my life, I would have tried to over explain to prove worth, and now Rajiv asked, now I conserve energy. He nodded approvingly. Wisdom is selective expenditure. Mira, they did not flaunt affection publicly to provoke critics, nor did they conceal it to appease them. And their relationship existed in a space beyond performance. When sharp-tongued acquaintances attempted sarcasm, second innings or risky R&D, Rajiv replied lightly, only for those who never learned from the first. When someone muttered about controversial partnerships, Mira answered calmly, controversy often accompanies conviction, no theatrics, no defensiveness, just precision. In private moments, they acknowledge the strain. There are days, Rajiv admitted, when I wish anonymity was possible. And there were days, Mira replied, when I was grateful. We are no longer afraid of exposure. The threats gradually diminished, not because hostility evaporated, but because reaction failed to materialize. Blackmail requires panic, they offered none. And instead, their work continued. Patience, he lectures, expanded, publications emerged. The narrative shifted organically from scandal to substance. One evening, seated on the balcony overlooking a city glittering with indifferent lights, Mira reflected aloud, I tried to nullify us. Raju glanced at her, and we are still here. He smiled, not triumphantly, quietly. We are defined by two questions, but who questions that? And he said, we defined us. And she leaned on into him, not seeking protection by sharing steady in the past and knocked loudly, maliciously, technologically. And this time it found not frightened, not no frightened woman running from pillar to post. It found two adults, mature, composed, and boastful, and who had already survived the worst. As that night deepened, the world's noise receded into distance. Their bond did not require applause; it requires endurance, and that possessed the abundance. The architecture of standards, out of persecution, they built purpose. It began not as an institution, but as an idea spoken between them, not one as quiet dawn. What if Mira said, stirring a tea absently, that all those who suffered in silence could find a structured space, not merely therapy but community. Rajiv listened and they started to think about starting something. They named it the Echo Foundation. And within months, the idea began to crystallize not as a reminder of pain but as a declaration that everything unheard voice deserved resonance. At first, it functioned through conferences, national seminars were organized in major cities Chennai, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Hyderabad, bringing together psychologists, cardiologists, legal experts, sociologists, and survivors willing to narrate their journeys. The scheme was consistent, healing, partnership, renewal. Unlike conventional forums, these gatherings did not sensationalize trauma. They analyzed it structurally, how workplace harassment silence professionals, how legal system traumatize complainants, how divorce in later life isolates individuals socially, how emptiness syndrome erodes identity, and Rajivetter's cardiac implications of chronic stress, and illustrating clinical precision, how unresolved emotional injury manifests psychologically, and hypertension, arrhythmia, and autoimmune vulnerabilities. Meera spoke not merely as a psychologist but as a lived testimony refined by scholarship. She deconstructed shame as a social construct, explained trauma bonding, illuminated the psychology of late night partnership, and single mothers abandoned after decades of marriage, divorced men estranged from adult children, and women over 50 deemed difficulty because they refused silence, retired professionals confronting empty homes as their children settled abroad, widowers afraid of remarry due to social gossip, voices trembled, then studied something extraordinary unfolded recognition. I thought I was alone, many confessed. You are not, Mira would answer, not sentimentally but firmly. Soon the demand expanded beyond national borders. Invitations arrived from Singapore, London, Toronto, Sydney, diaspora communities where cultural stigma around second marriages and mental health remained pronounced despite geographical relocations. And their international conferences were less about a spectacle and more about the structure. And they were engineering sustainability over the companionship. And out of these conferences emerged the new evolution, a living community. And on the outskirts of the quiet coastal town, land was acquired, funded partly by Rajiv's personal contributions, partly by philanthropists moved by the mission, and partly by anonymous donors who preferred silence to recognition. They envisioned not as an ashram, not as a catered luxury enclave, but a collaborative residential community, modest independent villas, shade gardens, 24/7 medical clinic, counseling suites, and a legal advisory wing, meditation halls, a library, communal dining spaces for those who preferred shared meals over solitary kitchen. Residents were screened not for wealth but for psychological readiness, and this was not a refuge for dependency, it was a space for renewal. And they were categories: abandoned spouses seeking stability, divorced individuals seeking companionship without coercion, and single parents whose children lived abroad, and professionals confronting emptiness syndrome, and survivors of abuse rebuilding identity, and elderly individuals unwilling to fade into invisibility. They instituted a compatibility framework, psychological assessment measuring temperament, conflict style, emotional regulation, value system, education orientation, financial expectation, and caregiving philosophy. Matches were not arranged hastily, they were cultivated through a dialogue, and Rajiv ensured that medical infrastructure was exemplary, and volunteers rotated, retired teachers conducting readings circles, and former bank officers financially arranging for literary workshops, and young law graduates assisting with documentation, nurses providing overnight care, philanthropists contributed without branding demands, some funded scholarship and theory. The community grew originally organized as an organization, distinguished was a tone, and there was no desperation in its corridors. So there was laughter, matured and guarded, and there were morning yoga session overlooking the sea, and there were evening debates about literature. There were couples who chose companionship without remarriage, and others who formalized unions quietly without a spectacle. And there were also those who chose solitude, finding in the community not to romance but for rest restoration. So it was a kind of felicitations, and Meera reminded volunteer during annual gatherings, not as a survivor. Rajiv added sustainability requires humility. The foundation expanded digitally as well, online support groups operating across time zones, confidential helplines, and staffed by trained counselors and virtual seminars for those unable to relocate. And they get customers at 3 a.m. somewhere across the globe. A lonely parent could speak to someone who understood, and at 5 a.m., a divorce executive in London could log into the moderate discussion about the rebuilding trust. 8 p.m., a single mother in Delhi could consult legal advisors about the property rights without intimidation. The Echo Foundation became less an organization and more a movement, and at its center stood not celebrity but example. Meera Rajiv did not romanticize their partnership publicly. They demonstrated quite consistency, shared leadership, and shared accountability, shared affection. Volunteers often remarked on their simplicity, no dramatic display, no hierarchical distances. Rajiv added, when the past becomes context, not identity, their evening, despite administrative burdens, remains sacred. A shared meal, brief work, sometimes silence, sometimes intellectual debate, sometimes laughter and absurdities of bureaucratic paperwork. Love for them was no longer a dramatic crescendo, it was a sustained architecture. Years later, as the community flourished, and the similar models were replicated. They had once fought merely to survive, reputational. And beside her, a soft hum of the community's nights, and her echo had once been a cry unheard. Now it was a chorus, and beside her stood Rajiv, not as a rescuer, but not as a redeemer, but as a companion in the quiet revolution of second chances. And in that soft hum of community's nights. Now they were building ecosystems of dignity. The echo of my shout comes to a conclusion. And beside her stood Rajiv, not as a rescuer, not as a redeemer, but as a companion in the quiet revolution of second chances.